All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Today we have the honor to have Professor Juliet Johnson, who is going to talk to us about understanding financial nationalism. So before further ado, let me present Professor Johnson. Juliet Johnson is chair and professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University in Montreal. She's an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and network director of the Jean Monnet Network between the EU and Russia, or BEAR. She's the author of Prisons of Prosperity, How Central Bankers Transformed the Post-Communist World, which was published with Cornell University Press in 2016, and which has won several awards in the past few years. She's also the author of A Fistful of Rubles, The Rise and Fall of the Russian Banking System, which also was published with Cornell University Press in 2000. As well as numerous scholarly and policy-oriented journal articles. So for many years, she was editor-in-chief of one of the leading journals in the field, Review of International Political Economy, and she currently serves on its International Advisory Board. Juliet, welcome to Bilkent once again, and we look forward to, and we are very excited about your talk.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Setkin, and I'm really happy to be here. And I'm glad to see such a good crowd. So Setkin mentioned the books that I've written. I'm not talking about any of those today. What I'm talking about is a topic that I know is close to Setkin's heart, and one that I've been working on and off for quite a while, primarily with Andrew Barnes of Kent State University. Which is trying to figure out what financial nationalism is, and in particular how it's manifested itself since the global financial crisis. Since then, there's been a lot of discussion about financial nationalism. The term gets thrown around a fair bit, but there's also a lot of conceptual confusion, and so that's what I want to do today. This is not a talk about any particular place where financial nationalism is happening. This is a talk where I'm trying to puzzle through exactly what financial nationalism is and is not. Because there's financial nationalism versus economic nationalism or economic patriotism. That is, nationalism that focuses on the financial sector versus nationalism that focuses more on trade. When people talk about economic nationalism, they typically mean trade. They don't necessarily go together. And this emphasis on trade has led to less focus on finance, which I actually think is more important in the contemporary world. And at the same time, there's often a conflation between or among the terms financial nationalism, financial protectionism, financial autarky, or financial statecraft. Again, they're often treated as synonyms, and they really shouldn't be. And I know that Eric Kaliner was here earlier talking about financial autarky, and he's been doing a lot of amazing work looking at the historical roots of economic nationalism, financial autarky. He's very careful with his terms and to try to separate out what they mean. But I have to say he's one of the only ones who is. So the goal in this talk today, and it's a work that's very much in progress, is trying to separate out what isn't financial nationalism, and in doing so to try to refine the concept to be more analytically useful. So in doing that, all right, there we go. In doing that, this is what I want to focus on today. First of all, what exactly is financial nationalism, and what's the difference between financial nationalism generally and what we're going to call illiberal financial nationalism? Then, after I talk about that, I'm going to talk about illiberal financial nationalism in the wake of the global financial crisis, and point out how it's fundamentally shaped by its emergence from within the international liberal order. So what's important to know about this, where I talk about globalized finance as constraint enabler, is that financial globalization both constrains the policy options of financial nationalists, and it provides opportunities for them to draw upon transnational financial resources and institutions to advance nationalist causes. So importantly, illiberal financial nationalism and financial nationalism more generally, arguably, is not characterized by the simple rejection of financial openness, and that would be financial autarky, but rather by the strategic deployment of that openness for the benefit of the nation. Okay, and at the end, we'll turn to the question of whether or not illiberal financial nationalism has a future. Is this project, to the extent it is a project, actually going anywhere? All right, so what is financial nationalism? First of all, and here's where it's really different from talking about protectionism, anarchy, autarky, whatever. The nationalism part you have to take seriously, right? You have to look at the stated motivation for engaging in these policies. You can't necessarily get into somebody's heart and say, oh, are they really motivated by nationalism, or are they using it opportunistically? But the stated motivation, at least, has to be a national one. And so here, first, you look at national purpose. All right. So what societies want, as Roy Abdullah famously has told us, depends on who they think they are. National identities are constructed, they're contested, and this matters for financial policy, right? So is our nation European, for example? And if so, what does that mean? Who are our national compatriots or enemies? What determines this? Is it some kind of historical or cultural relationship? And what is our nation's rightful place in the world? And then for nationalists in particular, the question is, who is one of us? So nationalists are drawing these contrasts between national insiders as opposed to foreign outsiders. And importantly, again, they're looking at collective rather than individual characteristics. So while they typically identify with a particular state, they don't necessarily consider all citizens or residents of that state to be members of the nation, while individuals outside state boundaries might be included as national compatriots. And it's also pretty common for nationalist politicians to identify a domestic but disloyal fifth column as well, right? Citizens and residents that are nevertheless not legitimate members of the nation for some reason or other, because of identities, relationships, or behaviors that nationalist politicians perceive as antithetical to the true nation. So the nationalism in financial nationalism has to be taken seriously. So then what's the financial part? So national purpose applied to the financial sector. An economic strategy that conflates state financial activism and national patriotism. So employing financial levers to promote the nation and the nation's collective unity, identity, or autonomy. All right, so this is how we're defining it, and trying to define it in a way that makes it conceptually distinct from these other phenomena. But you can't just define it, you have to look at how it manifests. What kind of policy preferences, what kind of policies come out of financial nationalist ideology? And here's where, again, we're trying to pin down this concept more clearly. So we're talking about then the four faces of financial nationalism to try to figure out the different ways in which it can manifest. And like good political scientists, we have a 2x2 box. And one dimension of the box, as you'll see, runs from insulating to revisionist. So insulating financial nationalism would include for us policies that try to control the state's exposure to the international system in some way in order to advance national autonomy and promote insiders. And then revisionist financial nationalism actively works against the existing financial order in some way. And then the second dimension of this box runs from internal to external. So internal financial nationalism will focus on the domestic arena, using or transforming the system internally to benefit national insiders, whereas external financial nationalism will focus on the state's role in the international financial system. Transforming the international or regional financial system for the benefit of the nation. And that can overlap with financial statecraft, but again, it's not necessarily the same thing. And just to give you one example, I would say, sanctions and sanctions policy, that's financial statecraft. That's not something that's typically done with a nationalist motivation or to advance the collective in some way. That's a straight up fitting in the realist box kind of policy. All right, so this is a general way to characterize the different sorts of policies, that or again, faces that financial nationalism can take. With this 2x2, we are not assuming that financial nationalism is going to take an illiberal kind of protectionist, autarkic form, right? It often can and does, but there can be other forms as well. The form that financial nationalism takes, and again, this is one of the things that I think conceptually makes it distinct, depends on the content of the nationalism. What is the national purpose? What is national identity? And who is part of the nation? And a pretty famous example of this, financial nationalism that doesn't take kind of a liberal form would be Estonia. Estonia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically their form of financial nationalism was in some ways quite a liberal one, embracing a currency board, pushing towards membership in the EU, the euro, inviting in foreign banks. As the national purpose, the content of the financial nationalism, the content of the nationalism was very much tied up with Europeanization. We are a European nation. We are not a former part of the Soviet Union. We want nothing to do with those Russians, and so the financial nationalism, very much nationalism, took what looked like a liberal form. Having said that, the dominant contemporary version of financial nationalism is an illiberal one. That is a financial nationalism that's a rejection of or a reaction against the liberal international order. And it's true Eric Helleiner will be the first to tell you that financial nationalism is a phenomenon, has a really long history. Its latest iteration did arise in response to the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, which stoked popular resentment against the post-war liberal order and made creating alternatives like financial nationalism thinkable in a way they hadn't been previously. So the backlash against this order gave content to the nationalism and encouraged a blend with populism in many places. And again, this collectivist anti-individual focus made this kind of nationalism, made it fit very well with an anti-liberal order view. So here I just have one of my favorite example quotes of a financial nationalist in action, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's State of the Nation address from February 2014. There are many, many, many quotes like this I could give you, but here's this one that sums it up. The truth is, we've had enough of the politics that is forever concerned with how we might satisfy the West, the bankers, big capital, and the foreign press. Over the past 4 years, we have overcome that subservient mentality. We once again have self-esteem, we have self-respect, and we have self-confidence, meaning Hungary will not succumb again. All right, so how does this kind of illiberal financial nationalism manifest? And so what we've done here is we took the 2x2 before, the 2x2 on financial nationalism and its four faces, and translated it into its into its illiberal version. So if you are an illiberal financial nationalist, what kind of policies are you going to adopt along each of these two axes? So for example, internal insulating policies, you're going to be looking at promoting domestic monetary sovereignty. You're going to be using activist monetary policies and there's going to be a primarily informal but a strong governmental preference for national insiders in banking and finance. And then if that internal financial nationalism moves toward a more revisionist iteration, then you're going to be taking much more formal legal and institutional measures to reduce foreign influence and increase national insider influence within the domestic financial system. So this is an even more activist policy, and one that's naturally going to receive more backlash from many others in the system. Similarly, if you look at the external axis, if you're just doing insulating policies, you're basically trying to increase national insider influence and control over foreign currency and capital flows to and from the nation. Where, so again, it's not challenging the system itself, it's changing the way you interact with the international system. Whereas if you move to an external revisionist face of financial nationalism, this is again where there starts to be some overlap with financial statecraft, where you're perhaps looking for an increased international role for your own currency, for your financial institutions, to create alternative multilateral institutions. And this is a box you can only do if you hold a relatively not necessarily privileged, but reasonably powerful place in a regional or in the international financial system. All right. So if we look a little bit more specifically at the kinds of policies this can entail, here's a messy but I think useful chart that breaks down the different kinds of policies you might see along each of these four axes, and looks at them in terms of what it means for the currency, what it means for the relationship of the government and the central bank, and what the central bank is doing, what it means for bank ownership and operation, and on the external axis, what it means in terms of that country's or that nation's relationship with the global financial system, and what kinds of things financial nationalist politicians are going to push. So I'm not going to go through and read all of this. I'll just talk for a minute or two about how this manifested in Hungary in particular, because it's the example that not only I'm most familiar with, but it's the one that's referred to most often in discussions about financial nationalism. And in Hungary, you see iterations of all kinds of illiberal financial nationalism, all of the faces except the external revisionist. They would love to do that, but they're not in the systemic position to do that. So financial nationalists came to power in Hungary in 2010, and Viktor Orban's coalition, led by his center-right Fidesz party, won these constitution-busting supermajorities in April 2010, 2014, and then 2018 elections. So he's been in power for a long time, and every time he's been running on this platform, nationalist populist platform of economic self-rule. And in fact, as early as 2012, Orban began using the term economic patriotism to describe his government's policies. But if you look at what they've actually done, the government's heavily concentrated its rhetoric and its policies on the financial sector, not only on the financial sector, but very heavily on the financial sector. Right after they came to power, they worked quickly to domesticate the private financial sector and to balance the budget on the back of foreign financial institutions. So if you look at 2010, when Orban came to power, over 85% of the Hungarian banking sector was foreign owned. So they implemented very quickly what they called a crisis tax, seeking to raise 200 billion foreign through a progressive tax on bank assets. And again, these were foreign bank assets. Bank taxes were then increased twice more in 2012 and 2013, and that and several other policies contributed to record losses in the sector. These measures served the dual purpose of reducing the federal deficit and significantly nationalizing the Hungarian financial sector, because it encouraged foreign banks to leave the country. So, the government had actually achieved its target of more than 50% domestic ownership of the financial sector by 2014 through a combination of foreign exit and domestic acquisition of major institutions. At the same time, the government moved to establish control over the National Bank of Hungary, very successful in that regard. And then the National Bank of Hungary, under the control of the government, took a lot of measures to support this financial nationalist agenda, including a push to re-domesticate Hungarian debt, to finance insiders through low-interest foreign loans, to convert foreign currency loans to foreign at below market interest rates, many kinds of policies like that. And perhaps most infamously, the National Bank and the government have established a series of well-funded foundations that have increasingly taken over the higher education sector in Hungary. And the intention, it's both deeply corrupt, but has an avowedly nationalist intention of reinforcing these kinds of financial nationalist economic doctrines, and again channeling financial resources to Fidesz supporters. So financial nationalism, in its illiberal form, its apparent success in Hungary, it spread to Poland, and then combined with rising populist sentiment in the region, has encouraged parties and politicians in several other states, most notably like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, and Serbia in the region, to flirt with financial nationalist rhetoric and policies as well. And at the same time, you see the parallel rise of financial nationalism and the use of financial statecraft in Russia, again, side by side, particularly the latter in response to US and EU sanctions. This is all encouraging financial nationalists in the EU's east, threatening European integration. And again, this is not a phenomenon that's limited necessarily to that region. But then what I want to point out here is that, again, it's crucial to recognize that financial nationalism is not characterized by the simple rejection of financial openness. It is not simply a push for financial autarky. Financial nationalist politicians are going to welcome external funds as long as they believe they can be harnessed in support of the nation. So, for example, they might encourage foreign investment to help build the national economy, but in very controlled and targeted ways, and in minority rather than majority shareholder roles. And in that sense, this illiberal financial nationalism, you can see it differs from standard less than liberal practices in the real world, what you might call ordinary illiberalism, in two significant ways. And first of all, this financial nationalism is justified in the language of exclusionary nationalism. It requires and relies on an othering of peoples or a world of peoples. It's not just about trying to build the domestic economy or a sector or a class. And we think this has pretty significant implications for how it operates politically. Second, financial nationalism typically moves pretty quickly beyond the policies of more ordinary illiberalism to challenge either the domestic or international liberal order, again, allegedly for the benefit of the nation. And here we want to make clear that we understand that the liberal order deserves and receives significant criticism, and we share a lot of that criticism. It could stand to be heavily reformed in order to make the playing field more level for weaker states in the system. But recognizing flaws in the liberal system doesn't necessarily mean accepting financial nationalist arguments that, for example, the problems are the fault of some ethnic, racial, religious, cultural, historical other, or that the scrapping of the current order would necessarily produce a more beneficial outcome for those weaker players. Then, turning to the last set of major points, interestingly and importantly, while post-crisis illiberal financial nationalism positions itself in opposition to the universalist norms of the liberal order, it is very much shaped by its emergence from within that order. And as such, it's both constrained by that order and able to take advantage of it. So if we look at the opportunities that the international order provides, and here, it's building off that original article we did, which very much focused on the international enablers of financial nationalism for Hungary, but this is true more generally. Under conditions of financial globalization, which these financial nationalists can't get away from, they have to deal with this. It means that even financial nationalists need access to external financing. They need to deal with the system. Here is where a lot of them, the ones that have been successful anyway, have been able to take advantage of the system. Financial nationalist governments can actually strategically exploit international finance to advance their illiberal financial nationalist agendas. And we point here to three particularly important sources of external finance, and sources that that on their own wouldn't necessarily be supportive of a financial nationalist agenda, but end up financing it. The first one, and a surprisingly important one, is direct financial assistance from international institutions like the IMF, or in the case of EU states or states that are close to joining the EU, European Union funds, especially through the structural and cohesion funds. So, for example, both Hungary and Poland are major recipients of EU transfer funds. Hungary is the largest recipient per capita, and neither of these countries would actually be able to keep their budget deficits within EU limits without this money. So they're very much taking EU funds and using it for purposes for which they were not necessarily intended. And the same kind of thing can be done with IMF finance. Another really important source of funding for financial nationalist governments can be bond markets. The international bond market, as long as the macroeconomic numbers are good, international bond markets don't necessarily punish other financial nationalist policies. Right? If all they care about is are they going to make money? Are they going to get their money back? Is there going to be a profit? And if the overall macro numbers are good, and if the international environment is one that encourages yield seeking, bond traders are going to be happy to pour their money into countries that are run by financial nationalists. And of course, a final source of external finance is trade, as well as selective permission for foreign direct and portfolio investment. And here again, remember that financial nationalism and economic nationalism don't necessarily go together. Governments might try to do both things, but you can be very financial nationalist while still having quite open and wanting quite open trade relationships. That is, like WTO membership is very compatible with financial nationalism. And again, for countries that belong to the EU, this is also quite helpful because trade markets are open, and this is a source of regular capital infusions. Now, having said that, that they can strategically exploit international finance, it also means there are some constraints, right? So in particular, in order to work in the environment of financial globalization, financial nationalists have to avoid policies that will lead to very high inflation, currency instability, unsustainable debt. It can, some policies of the Turkish government might be pointed to here as a way not to do financial nationalism. But the very nature of illiberal financial nationalism within the current liberal order actually supports, or can support this goal. The internal goal of achieving monetary sovereignty in an external environment of financial globalization creates natural pressures for more orthodox macroeconomic outcomes, that is reasonably low inflation and external debt. But it's important to recognize again that the pressure is for orthodox outcomes on monetary policy, on macroeconomic indicators. Now, the way that you might get there could be very different than those a more liberal government might choose, and they might have very different distributional implications. All right, so I'm going to skip the financial versus economic nationalism because I think I've already covered that, and we're running short of time. I just want to get to my two final questions. First of all, does illiberal financial nationalism require non-democratic government? And the answer here is maybe. It certainly encourages it. It's co-evolved with political illiberalism certainly in the post-communist world. Its rise has coincided more broadly with a resurgence of anti-democratic populism internationally. It entails, as we've said, explicit othering of large parts of the world, including segments of the domestic population. And when, either through policy or rhetoric, outsiders' voices are effectively marginalized, it can certainly undermine basic principles of democratic rule and the rule of law. And beyond that, illiberal financial nationalist policies tend to require a high degree of state coordination and control. I mean, it's an ideology of change and one in many respects of centralization. And doing this can be complicated for democracies that have meaningful opposition parties, especially if you're interested in revisionist financial nationalism, which tries to disempower alleged outsiders who actually already have financial roots and resources in the country. So overall, if financial nationalism, if it may not require domestic political illiberalism, it certainly seems to foster it and to benefit from it. And finally, and I'd like to think through this question a lot more. Does illiberal financial nationalism require globalized finance? Or another way of putting this is, could enough states pursue these policies on their own and become so great a strain on the liberal system that it stops functioning in some way, right? Lots of individual countries pursuing illiberal financial nationalism at home isn't going to replace the liberal order. But as we try to argue, the success of financial nationalist policies often relies on a parasitic relationship with globalized finance. So it's not actually clear whether the spread of these kinds of policies further and further around the world would eventually damage or kill the host, or at least cause a much more significant reaction than there has been so far. Beyond that, though, only external revisionist policies would represent direct systemic challenges to the international liberal order. Russia's been the most consistent and powerful advocate for these kinds of changes in the global system. The US government under Donald Trump, and we can argue whether or not there was financial nationalism there or not, but it often seemed pretty ready to abandon existing institutions as well. But China is not necessarily interested in breaking the system. Although its government may feel both pressure and opportunity to take a greater role in restructuring it if it appears ready to break, or suffers a great deal because of the actions of many others. Again, if this kind of illiberal financial nationalism does spread. So again, this means external revisionist financial nationalist policies by major players need to be taken seriously, but at the same time, it's important to recognize that this external revisionist face hasn't so far resonated at the systemic level in the same way that the other versions have resonated within many domestic polities. So with that, I will leave it. Thank you. This is, again, the beginning of our attempts to think through what financial nationalism is and is not. So I very much look forward to your questions and suggestions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Juliet. So I think now I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, suggestions, and I'll save my my own questions for later. Yep, Refet Hocam, please.
Thank you. I'm an economist, so please forgive me for whatever inane things I am surely will be asking. But part of this is, could you talk a little bit? So I have two things, I think. One is, could you talk a little bit about the difference between financial nationalism and nation building through finance? Mm-hmm. Because your definition to me sounded more along the lines of nation building than nationalism. Mm-hmm. And the other one is, can you talk a little bit about the difference between financial nationalism and, to some places where it came dangerously close, I guess it's just outright corruption, called nationalism. So how much of nationalism in there versus how much of rent-seeking under the guise of nationalism? Mm-hmm.
And Seckin, you want me to go ahead and answer one by one?
This is entirely up to you, Sue. So however you wish.
I'm happy to do that. And these are really good questions, right? And what's financial nationalism? What's the difference between financial nationalism and nation building through finance? I mean, I actually don't think, but I am happy. I'm happy to hear arguments about this again because we're still working through this. I don't think there is necessarily a difference. If by nation building you mean nation building and not state building, focusing on the difference between those two things. If you are using finance for for the purpose of advancing the collective interest of a group of people that's not necessarily defined by by state boundaries, but by a collective identity, then I think that can be characterized as financial nationalism. And again, this is also part of of my insistence that financial nationalism shouldn't necessarily be considered a pejorative term, right? And it can take a lot of different forms. So if you want to use financial means to advance the interests of your nation, and you call it nation building, I would say, yeah, that can be financial nationalism. Now, the connection between financial nationalism and corruption, I think this is very important for two reasons. First of all, and corruption and rent seeking. First of all, well, you certainly see that everywhere. But okay, there are two things to separate out here. Are financial nationalists particularly prone to corruption? And is financial nationalist rhetoric actually a cover for rent seeking? That is it is it just opportunistic rhetoric to cover up the usual kind of stealing that politicians like to do when they can get away with it? For the first, is it more likely than is it likely to involve a fair bit of corruption? I actually think yes, it probably is, just because it by definition involves a great deal of state activism, right? And so if you're going to have heavy government involvement, if you're going to have heavy government involvement in the financial sector, you're going to create opportunities for corruption. And those opportunities will be taken. And also, if you're a financial nationalist, that again means you've identified national insiders and outsiders. You're trying to direct financial resources towards the insiders. you can say, all right, this is for the benefit of the nation, the collective, but there are individual insiders who are benefiting from that because of their relationship to the government. And again, is that is that nationalism? Is that corruption? It can kind of be both things. On the question of opportunism, and this is something that that we can, it's a charge you can put on any financial nationalist politician. It's one that I've thought about a lot in the context of Hungary and Orban. Do they really believe this stuff, or are they saying these kinds of things in order to justify rent seeking and corruption? And in one sense it matters, in the other sense it doesn't matter. In one sense it matters because if they don't truly believe it, then they will quickly change their rhetoric and policies if it stops working. All right. Whereas if it's something, if it's a true commitment, it's not going to, disconfirming evidence is not going to change the policy prescriptions. So in that sense, it matters if it's opportunistic. On the other hand, given that it's used as a tool of political legitimation, and you can certainly gain a whole lot of political support from saying, look, we're sticking it to those Western bankers, to the extent that it's effective and it's resonant politically, precisely because of the appeal to national identity and nationalist rhetoric and the use of insiders and outsiders, then it really does matter that it takes on this nationalist form. There are a lot of other ways you could try to justify these policies, or you could try not to at all. But the fact that couching these policies in their nationalist form is what brought so many of these leaders to power, and is what has kept them in power, means that you don't want to, you don't want to just say, oh, it's just all about corruption. Now, the content of the ideas and the power of the ideas and the way that they serve a legitimating factor really matters.
Excellent. Bilin Hoca, you're next.
Thank you very much again. I'm also an economist, Juliet, so my question is going to be along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say financial nationalism, do you mean a policy or an ideology, really? So if it is about the state ideology, now within the state you have the, do you really differentiate that between ideology and a policy? Because when you make that differentiation, under the state, there's the central bank as different from other financial market policies, perhaps, right? Yes, they can be connected, but when you look at the central bank policies, that may be confined to certain framework that defines the position of the central bank, such as the monetary union or the currency board or an independent central bank. Accordingly, there will be certain policies that sort of ties up the hands of central bank in some ways, as opposed to the financial market strategies that a government may adopt from time to time. So I was wondering if it would help you to sort of confine your categorizations or taxonomy into the central bank versus the financial market policy separately. Thank you.
Separate. Yeah. Okay. So again, two things here, and really, really interesting question. Is it an ideology or is it policy? And I think you have to say, and here's where, here's where again it gets tricky. This is a really tricky concept to work with, and I have to say many times in doing this, I've I've thought to myself, why am I doing this? Why am I, why am I bothering to try to wrap my head around this? And I keep coming back to the fact that I think there really is something different and especially politically, but also economically important here. So distinguishing between it's an ideology first and foremost, right? And it's an ideology that, depending on the form it takes, has certain policy implications. Now, here's something that's also important. You can have people, within the government or within a polity who have this, who share this ideology in some form. That doesn't mean they necessarily have the power to either propose policies or implement them. That's going to depend on other things. So holding the ideology, selecting the policies, and implementing the policies are all separate, and you can only, and so the policies selected will depend on the content of the nationalism, and the extent to which you can implement them depends on how much control financial nationalists have over the government and the position of that nation in the international system. Now, on the central bank, central banks. So you're saying central banks are different from the other kind of financial nationalist policies because, in great part, because their missions or their ability to do what they do is defined by a prior rule, a currency board, central bank independence. Things that actually tie the hand of the central bank. Part of what I'm arguing, I think, especially in terms of illiberal financial nationalism, is that financial nationalist governments want to cut those ties, right? They don't want central banks to be independent. They prefer not to have currency boards. They want to be able to implement an activist monetary policy. And so this is actually one of the key things that you see in states where financial nationalists have come to power in full or in part, is there's an immediate attempt to try to undermine the central bank, either in legal terms by actually lowering the legal independence of the central bank, or informally by putting other financial nationalists in those roles. And so, well, the central bank may be legally independent. In practice, it doesn't operate that way. And you actually see a lot of this, real breakdown between what's written in law and what happens in practice in terms of central banking. And you also see a resistance to entering into currency boards or currency unions, and that's an important part of the financial nationalism in Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and in the Baltic states to the extent that it's there, is this resistance to joining the Eurozone, even though those countries are actually legally obligated by the EU treaty terms to enter. So I think you have to treat the central bank separately, but I think this attempt to gain control over the central bank is a very important part of illiberal financial nationalist policy goals, and so I address it separately, but it needs to be addressed in my view.
Great. Kaan is next.
Thank you. Thank you as well, Professor Johnson, for your time. I was curious, you mentioned democracy, and do you believe there is any worth in qualifying that term? Because we see, electoral democracies and liberal democracies and countries with absolutely no democracy. So do you believe there is any worth in qualifying this type of democracy for the purposes of your idea? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's that's an interesting question. So because it's not, it's not the central thing that we're engaging, but it's an important implication, right? And I think you're right that democracy can mean a lot of different things, and we don't mean all of those things. What we really mean is rule of law and the extent to which political power is centralized in one place. Hopefully somebody else will get that. Good. And so yeah, we're using the big word democracy as a shorthand for some more specific things.
Okay, excellent. Ecem is next.
I would like to say that I'm very grateful for this beautiful seminar. Actually, my question is about the populist regimes and their fiscal policies about financial nationalism. Well, I think in order to get more votes and support from inner politics, sometimes in the name of financial nationalism, actually they could implement more unstable fiscal policies, and actually it would make high inflation and worse situation. So actually, I think there is a dilemma in this situation because, as you said that in your presentation, actually financial constraints are needed, but in order to not lose votes and remain political support, maybe they will not be willing to apply budget constraint. But if they do not apply budget constraint, then the international financial organizations will not maybe be willing to support financial support. So how this dilemma could be solved? My question is that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it can't necessarily be solved, right? It is a dilemma, and it's one of the. It may be one of the self-limiting features of financial nationalism in this globalized world, to the extent to which popular financial nationalist politics or policies domestically clash with what would be necessary to keep money flowing from the outside. And I think actually, I mean, I don't know as much about this case, but I actually think if you look at Greece and the wild back and forth policies of Syriza in terms of thinking about exiting the Eurozone and the extent to which they were willing to deal with the troika. I actually think you see that tension playing out very clearly in that particular case. And again, it did not work out well for the financial nationalists at all, because you either, if you have a real dilemma like this, you either end up capitulating to the international financial forces that you claimed you don't want to capitulate to, or you end up tanking your domestic economy, and it's difficult to walk that tightrope. That's actually one of the reasons. That's the reason that that Andrew Barnes and I wrote that paper on Hungary back in, I think we wrote it came out in 2015, but we actually wrote it 2 years before, as these things go, right? Because we wanted to figure out why that hadn't happened in Hungary, because everybody expected it to. I mean, really, if you look at it from a strictly economic point of view, financial nationalism under current international circumstances, it shouldn't work. All right, these should be fairly short-lived regimes, and the policies ought to fail most of the time. And we were trying to figure out why in that particular case it didn't. But I think most of the time it does. Either financial nationalists aren't able to come to power because of this obvious paradox, or when they do, they engage in policies that either undermine their legitimacy. That undermine their legitimacy either because they're seen as capitulating to the international system, or because they can't maintain macroeconomic stability in their own countries while trying to implement these policies.
Excellent. Juliet, how are we doing time-wise?
Well, we've got a few minutes left. I'm okay. So yeah, if there is another question or two, I'm very happy to address them. This is I see there are 73 people here. This is great, by the way. I'm really impressed, and the questions are amazing too.
Yeah.
And after this talk too, if anybody has any thoughts about this, please email me. Again, this is what financial nationalism is, how it manifests, what it is and is not, and what its potential future is. These are not questions that one person can get their head around alone. No, this is going to be a big, long, ongoing debate. This is going to turn into a paper, and once it gets published, there are going to probably be a lot of papers after that trying to explain why we are wrong or it should be changed, and many of those will probably be right as well. So,
yeah. So that's what I'm going to do after this talk then. So I'll save my questions and comments for later, because I see that 3 more people would like to ask questions. Emina, please.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Professor Johnson, for this wonderful lecture. So I wanted to ask a bit more wider question, particularly like I read a lot of your work, like a lot religiously, on central bank independence, on PAT dependence, PAT contingency, and so on and so forth. So I also worked on monetary policy regimes in Yugoslavia and on traditions from, to currency boards and direct euroization that happened. So what I wanted to ask you was, if I remember correctly, you had an argument about socialization in Priests of Prosperity. So there was this very important, there was this very interesting section where you said, something about how you can always recognize the central bankers in the room because they all, they look similar, they talk similar, they speak the same language. Mm-hmm. So at that point in the 90s, right, during the transition and after the transition, what happened was that, as you say, central bankers from Eastern Europe spoke the same language with Western central bankers, but they weren't necessarily speaking the same language with domestic institutions. Do you think that we can notice something, the exact opposite happening right now? So Western central bankers speaking one language and then the others speaking another language that's intelligible to the Western central bankers in the states that have this reflex towards financial nationalism. Thank you. I'm sorry this took so long.
No, and that's very interesting. It's something I've been thinking about. It happens to the extent that that financial nationalists are able to take over the central bank and to take over in really fundamental ways. Again, Hungary is a great example of this because, so when Orban changed the director of the central bank, he put in this guy Matolci, who had been who'd been like his economics and trade minister, and who had not been socialized in the international central banking community, transnational banking community at all, and in fact was quite hostile to it. And so he went into the central bank and started replacing people like crazy. He booted out or forced out in one way or another most of the division heads, gutted the research department and the monetary policy department, and then the people who decided to stay, some people who had been socialized into the transnational central banking community, and this is a very interesting group, they decided to stay in order to, as they would say quietly, minimize the damage. So kind of work not necessarily against the regime, but to dull its most extreme financial nationalist impulses. So in that sense, there might not have been a fifth column before, but they inadvertently created one within the central bank. So now there's definitely a high level group of people within the National Bank of Hungary who who are very much in opposition to this transnational central banking community. And you see this to a certain extent in other central banks too, but certainly not in as extreme a way. I mean, Hungary is the big example of it, in part because the Orban government decided that the central bank was going to be its main tool to implement financial nationalism. But yeah, in that sense, financial nationalism does represent an interesting challenge to the to the hegemony and the uniformity of the transnational central banking community, which was already pretty deeply challenged by the global financial crisis. To the the extent to which it was actually, at least in part, a result of mistakes by central banks in the advanced industrial democracies.
So Juliet, can you take one last question?
Yep, I can do one more.
All right, so Ali gets to ask the last question then.
Hello, do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for this great talk today. At the end of your slides, you have already talked about how illiberal financial nationalism can go hand in hand with non-democratic forms of government. And my question is on regime type. You have showed us a 2x2. My question is, which regime type, for example, follows internal insulating policies, and which regime types follow, for example, external and revisionist policies? I mean, we may think as, this is an empirical question, but I want to hear your opinions. Maybe we can collect data and do some analysis, but I want to know your opinion first.
Yeah, no, this is really a really good point. And again, we haven't thought about regime type as much, but I do think, again, if you just eyeball it, there is a correlation there, right? So if you look at the countries that would follow external revisionist policies, they are not democracies. It's Russia, it's China. On regional levels, it tends to be states that are not that are at least what we would say competitive authoritarian. And I think that makes sense in a lot of ways. And I think in part that's because, again, financial nationalism, because it's inherently collectivist. It's not especially compatible with the ideology of the powerful democratic countries that would have the ability to engage in external revisionist policies. Also, why would they engage in external revisionist policies? They already run the show. What do they want to revise? So I do think, at least right now, at least in the contemporary world, external revisionist policies, that kind of financial nationalism is going to go pretty clearly with at least, again, competitive authoritarian states. Whereas the other kinds, I don't think, I think those, even though, if you really want to have an activist financial nationalist policy, it's probably not going to be great for the rule of law. It's probably going to lead to more political centralization. I think it's probably equally likely for that kind of sentiment, for those kinds of politicians to come to power in democratic as opposed to less democratic countries. I don't, in that sense, I don't think regime type would matter as much. But that's an empirical question. We'll see. This is also one of the tough things about political science and IR, right? We're trying to figure out things that are happening right now, and so what it looks like today may be very different 5 years from now. Here's where in some respects, envy Eric Leiner and think maybe he's on the right track and focusing on the historical manifestations of all of this, because you can say something, I think, much more definitive than the exercise that we're trying to do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Juliet, for a wonderful talk on financial nationalism. It was extremely thought-provoking and productive for us. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, especially the Q&A. And let me conclude with a personal note. Juliet was my PhD supervisor at McGill University, and I hope that at least the students in my graduate seminar can see how heavily positively influenced I have been by Juliet's work, and I continue to do so. So this was a great pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much once again, and hope to see you soon.
Absolutely, thank you. It was a great pleasure for me as well. And again, please don't stop here. Email me, send me your thoughts and criticisms and all of that. I am always happy to hear more.
We will.
Right.
Goodbye.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.